James A. Garfield was shot by an assassin on July 2, 1881. 2 months later, on September 19th, he died from medical complications. At the time, 2 former presidents were alive, along with 10 future presidents. 18th President Ulysses S. Grant was the earliest president still living. He was 59 and living in New York. Garfield was shot at 9:30 in the morning, and Grant learned of the attack shortly afterwards and condemned it as a, quote, dastardly attempt and a, quote, terrible crime. Grant and Garfield once had a friendly relationship, but politics got between them. It was Garfield who received the 1880 Republican nomination, which Grant had desired, as Grant was seeking a 3rd presidential term. In a time when Grant believed the country needed a strong leader, it had Garfield, who Grant said had no backbone. Grant ceased all criticisms after the assassination. Though he gave his hopes to Garfield's recovery, he couldn't share in the public's optimism. Quote, I have known a great many cases of men shot very much in the same way, where the ball was lodged where it could not be found. The men would rally after the shock, and then suddenly change for the worse, contrary to the expectations of the patient and physicians, and then die in a few hours. 2 months later, Grant's expectations were confirmed. Grant's son Fred, who was visiting at the time, said his father was, quote, weeping bitterly, and that he'd never seen his father, quote, so terribly affected. Considering the assassination of Abraham Lincoln just 16 years earlier, Grant lamented that political violence might simply be a new reality for the nation. Rutherford B. Hayes, Garfield's immediate predecessor, was at his Ohio home when Garfield was shot. In his diary, he dismayed over the political implications more than he spoke of his personal feelings towards Garfield. As president, Hayes had been involved in an intense battle within the Republican Party for reform. He was confident Garfield would carry on his efforts. In contrast, he believed Vice President Chester A. Arthur to be a product of that corruption. He called the prospect of an Arthur presidency a, quote, national calamity. He added that Arthur's presidency would be worse than that of Andrew Johnson's, and that it would doom the Republican Party. He was, however, much more optimistic about Garfield's chances of recovery. He even began writing to Garfield about future political matters. He also noted that hope for Garfield's recovery had united the nation in a way it hadn't been for a long time, and remarked that, if Garfield lived, he could leverage the situation to push his agenda. Hayes was woken up on the night of September 19th and delivered the news of Garfield's death. The next morning he wrote, quote, I have just heard with the deepest sorrow that President Garfield is dead. He was the best-loved man in the United States. Whatever the people can do to show their affection for him and their sympathy with Mrs. Garfield and his mother and children, they will do promptly with all their hearts. Publicly, he blamed the assassination on the bitter partisanship in the country, especially within the Republican Party, and he again called for political reforms. Vice President Chester A. Arthur was in Albany, New York, and was said to be filled with anxiety. Arthur was hated across the country. His whole political career had been built on the patronage system that Garfield had promised to reform. His name was so synonymous with corruption that, in the election of 1880, some Republicans wanted to vote for Garfield as president and the Democratic vice presidential candidate. There was even a conspiracy theory claiming Arthur ordered the assassination. While this died down quickly, the hatred for him didn't, and some wondered whether Arthur would be assassinated in retaliation. Others actually called for Arthur to step up as acting president while Garfield was bedridden. Arthur made no attempt. In fact, as many in politics traveled to the Capitol to meet with the sickly president and offer condolences to his family, Arthur never left Albany until the news of Garfield's death came. That night, a reporter tried to get a comment from Arthur, but was turned away by his secretary, who said, quote, he is sitting alone in his room, sobbing like a child. I dare not disturb him. Before leaving for D.C., Arthur wrote a letter filled with special instructions for Garfield's cabinet. It gave details about presidential succession in the event he didn't survive his trip. As the new president, Arthur surprised the nation by stating his commitment to carry out Garfield's reform efforts. His motives remain unknown. as he had most of his papers destroyed upon his death. Suspected motives include fear of assassination, sympathy over Garfield's death, or a desire to leave a positive legacy. In January of 1883, Arthur signed into law the Pendleton Act, which mandated that most federal positions be based on merit rather than political patronage. Grover Cleveland was 44 and working as an attorney in Buffalo, New York. His reaction doesn't seem to have been recorded. Unlike Grant, Hayes, and Arthur, Cleveland wasn't a man deeply entrenched in politics. At this point, the closest he'd come to politics was serving as a county sheriff 10 years prior. None of his contemporary writings make mention of the assassination. On May 12, 1887, during his first term as president, he spoke at the unveiling ceremony for a statue of Garfield, saying it stood as a sign of forgotten animosities. He described Garfield as a man who'd shown, quote, loving tenderness in every domestic relation, bravery on the field of battle, fame and distinction in our halls of legislation, and the highest honor and dignity in the chief magistracy of the nation. As it's unlikely Cleveland ever met Garfield, his references to Garfield's character were more likely based on the reputation Garfield had. Benjamin Harrison was 48, only 2 years younger than Garfield, and was serving as a senator from Indiana. He was in his law office when a reporter rushed in delivering the news. Harrison declined to give a formal statement, saying his anxiety made it impossible. Harrison and Garfield had become well acquainted at the 1880 Republican National Convention. From then to the election, they worked together very closely. In one letter to Harrison, Garfield called him one of the few people he actually trusted in politics, and practically begged him to join his cabinet. Harrison couldn't because of prior commitments. Harrison immediately made a trip to Washington to see Garfield and comfort his family. He stayed for a week, left once he was confident Garfield was improving, and made sure he was consistently updated about Garfield's health. 2 months later, when Garfield died, Harrison spoke at a service in his honor. Described as visibly emotional, he assured people that God still reigned and recounted his friendship with the deceased president, whose greatest qualities he described as a gift of speech and, quote, a family life that was deep with devotion and inspiration. During his own presidency, he spoke at another service in Garfield's honor. He lamented that the nation would never know a full Garfield presidency, but remarked it would have been following, quote, a career that had no incident of failure or inadequacy. William McKinley was in California conducting political business. He immediately headed back east where he kept up with the news of Garfield's condition, saying, quote, the public suspense is awful. When Garfield died in September, McKinley was unable to attend the funeral due to his wife's health, but nonetheless, he took part in planning the memorial services. McKinley was 38 and, with Garfield's help, a rising star in the Republican Party. As Ohioans and Civil War veterans, they were both from the same political clique. Earlier in 1881, Garfield chose McKinley to fill a vacancy on the Ways and Means Committee, an incredible opportunity for McKinley so early in his political career. Without a personal connection to Arthur, McKinley's political ambitions were delayed. Theodore Roosevelt was 22 and vacationing in Europe. His diary contains updates on Garfield's health and hopes for his recovery. Though the two never met, Roosevelt admired the president, and the death affected him. Roosevelt was just beginning his political career. As the assassination led to the collapse of the stalwart faction of the Republican Party, the faction Arthur was part of, it also led to an opening for Roosevelt, rather than a stalwart, to get elected to the New York State Assembly in 1882. 2 decades later, Roosevelt only assumed the presidency because of William McKinley's assassination. Because of these 2 assassinations within the span of 20 years, Roosevelt assigned the Secret Service to presidential security. As president, he also gave a cabinet position to Garfield's eldest son, who Roosevelt mentored, and who would become one of Roosevelt's most loyal allies. For most later presidents, there seems to be no information on how they reacted. William Howard Taft was 23. He was no stranger to the world of politics, as only a year later in 1882, President Arthur gave him an appointment. However, his reaction to Garfield's assassination doesn't seem to have been recorded. Woodrow Wilson was 26 and studying law. His letters from around the time make no mention of the assassination. In Wilson's writings on government, he did mention how presidents shouldn't deal directly with office seekers, a sentiment that may have been affected by the assassination, as Garfield's assassin, Charles Guiteau, was a disgruntled office seeker. Warren G. Harding was 15. As he was from Ohio, Garfield would have been his congressman growing up. At the time of Garfield's election and presidency, Harding was one of the few Republicans in a highly Democratic town where young people were passionate about politics, so it's hard to imagine he would have been ambivalent about such an event. Calvin Coolidge, who was growing up in Vermont, turned 9 just 2 days after Garfield was shot. His father was active in local politics and a Republican. However, not even in Coolidge's autobiography did he mention his reaction to the assassination. Herbert Hoover was only 7, growing up in the recently incorporated small town of West Branch, Iowa. In 1880, he took part in the Torchlight Parade for Garfield's presidential campaign, which was his first exposure to national politics. Hoover wrote of the assassination in his memoirs, quote, "Another touch of national life was the assassination of Garfield. The flag over the main store was placed at half-mast. All of the people moved in hushed, anxious hours while his life lingered on. It was thus that I learned some great man was at the helm of our country." If you enjoyed this video, consider watching other videos from this channel on how different presidents throughout United States history reacted to major events such as the assassinations of Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. You can also browse the channel for more videos on United States presidents all the way from George Washington to modern times, discussing their political careers, personal lives, and places in history.